Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having myself on behalf of our team present at the Connect CACNA1C Global Network Conference. My name's Mia St. John. I'm a speech pathologist and a postdoctoral researcher from Melbourne, Australia. Hence why this talk is being pre-recorded, as I'm probably asleep at the time that this conference is happening, but I am absolutely so pleased to be able to speak to you all. And in a few weeks' time, I will be running a bit of a Q&A after this talk. So hopefully this gives families some insights into what we are planning to do for this project. And then families will have the opportunity to ask questions at a later date. But please feel free to email me questions, myself or Professor Angela Morgan, who leads our lab here in Melbourne, with any questions that you have about the research. I'll have my email at the end of these slides. So today I am talking about the importance of understanding communication in CACNA1C related disorders. And I'm sure for many people watching, this is quite obvious why communication and understanding communication is really important for your children and loved ones and family members. It's an area of research that our team are particularly passionate about, is understanding why some individuals with genetic conditions or genetic related disorders have significant communication challenges and why some communication challenges are really different to others. And I'll talk a little bit about what those differences are and why it's really important that we tease out those differences in a research project like this that we are planning to do. For a little bit of context about how this study came about, I believe it was my lab head, Angela Morgan, who met Sophie Muir at a conference some time ago, and they really both agreed that understanding communication in CACNA1C related condition is really important. And so we've been working towards getting some funding in order to start this study. So this is an overview of what the study will look like and why it's important. And then I've got an expression of interest form at the end of this so we can start to make a list of families who we can potentially work with in the future. So this is a bit about where I am from. Like I said, I'm from Melbourne, Australia. I work at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, and this is our team here within the MCRI. So we are part of the Translational Centre for Speech Disorders here at MCRI. And then the bottom right-hand picture is the University of Melbourne, where I also teach in speech pathology, linguistics and phonetics, and have a real passion for genetics and speech here in my research role. So I mentioned we're part of the Translational Centre for Speech Disorders. What that means is it's funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council here in Australia, group of experts in speech pathology, neurology. We have pediatric neurologists on our team, neuroscientists, geneticists, genetic counsellors, bioinformaticians, and the vision of this research group is to improve the outcomes of children who have speech disorders by understanding more about the genetics. So we work with specific genetic conditions like CACNA1C in order to improve diagnosis, improve prognosis, so understand what the future trajectory might look like in a particular condition. And then in the future, the aim is to then help enable precision medicine, precision therapies or precision medicine to improve long-term impacts for future kids who are diagnosed with genetic conditions. And as I mentioned, we're funded by the National Health and Medical Research Council. So before I get into CACNA1C specifically, I like to give a background on speech and language more generally. When we talk about speech and language, we think that those two terms are synonymous, similar, they mean the same thing, but actually to a speech pathologist, these are two very distinct things, speech and language. So you can think about communication here in the middle as an overarching or umbrella term. And underneath that banner of communication, we can have speech. And when I say speech, I'm talking about the perception and production of speech sounds. So, how the sounds come out, how your mouth, your lips, your tongue move to create those sounds. Whereas language is the production and understanding of words and grammar to communicate meaning. So here we're thinking about vocabulary, sentence structure, what you understand when somebody's talking to you. So, as a bit of an analogy, if a child looked at this picture in the middle here of a rabbit and they said wabbit, well, that would be a speech challenge. They understand the concept of what a rabbit is, they can name it, they've got that word in the vocabulary, but the sounds are coming out a little bit incorrect. Wabbit for rabbit. If a different child looked at that picture and they thought, oh, that's a cat. Well, there's no problem with the articulation or the speech sounds of the word cat. They're producing it all nice and clearly, but they don't have the concept or the vocabulary, the underlying meaning of what that thing is. So that would be a challenge with language, expressive or receptive language. Another analogy you might think of is perhaps when you go to the dentist and you get maybe have dental surgery or get your wisdom teeth taken out, and you're really unclear when you're speaking afterwards. So you sound a little bit muffled, you might sound a little bit slurred or slower when you're talking. There's no challenge there with your language. You still understand everything that's being said to you. You still have the same grammar or syntax. You know the words that you want to say, but your speech is coming out unclear. So that's a different type of speech challenge to the rabbit wabbit, but it all comes under the umbrella of speech. So it's a really important distinction that people often mix up, and not just any old people, but often doctors and medical professionals who are writing about speech and language in publications often just use those terms interchangeably, which is absolutely fair enough. We know there's a challenge with communication, but what we're really interested in breaking down the specifics of the differences in speech and language. And then what you can do is break down those even further. So, under the banner of language, you might have challenges with receptive language. So, what you understand when others are speaking to you, or how much you understand, or your expressive language, what you can communicate yourself. We also talk about more social or pragmatic language. So, thinking about social contexts, which is another comes under the banner of language, and then under the banner of speech. We can have articulation challenges or phonological challenges, which for the most part are more common and more easily treatable, both articulation and phonology. Like my rabbit wabbit example might be a phonological challenge. And then we have some other disorders. So we have childhood apraxia of speech, dysarthria, and stuttering. And these three conditions are all what we call motor speech disorders. So it's a different challenge in the brain. Childhood apraxia of speech is a challenge with motor planning and programming. So a child knows what they want to say, but they can't plan and program the specific nuanced movements that we so take for granted when we're communicating that you need to talk. Dysarthria is a challenge of neuromuscular execution. So neuro meaning in the brain, muscular meaning with the muscles of speech. So a child with a dysarthria might sound quite slurred or unclear. And then stuttering is often more understood. We see stuttering more commonly in the general population, and that's a repetition or a blocking of speech sounds. And so these three conditions all come under our banner of motor speech disorders, whereas our articulation and our phonological challenges are considered developmental or functional, and they're a little bit easier to treat. What we find with our genetic conditions, perhaps like CACNA1C, is that our motor speech difficulties or our motor speech disorders, like childhood apraxia of speech and dysarthria, are overrepresented in these genetic groups, whereas they're particularly rare in the typical population. And it's really important that we make this distinction between does a child have an articulation challenge or does a child actually have apraxia of speech? Because knowing this distinction means that we can treat that child effectively. Our treatments and our approaches, management approaches for an articulation disorder versus an apraxia of speech are completely different. And so we know that many families spend a lot of time, money, and effort treating the incorrect speech disorder. And so it's really important that we get that correct from the beginning. And so that's what our studies try to do, is to delineate between those speech and language challenges. So what our group has done is to work with children who have apraxia of speech or childhood apraxia of speech, which is of particular interest to us. And we assess the communication of that child and then analyse their genetics. And then we find that there might be a change or a perturbation in a particular gene, for example, CACNA1C. And then we aim to find a group of other children who have changes in CACNA1C. And we ask ourselves some questions about that group. So, what is the speech and language of these individuals? Do they all have apraxia of speech? Are they all similar, or are they all different? Is the profile similar amongst every child at different age groups, or does it change over time depending on what age we're looking at? And so these are projects that we've done with a number of other groups. I've been working with genetic groups for almost 10 years now. And these are just some examples of some of the genes that we have studied in our group, not me personally, but others in our group as well. And I thought I'd just give some examples of a few of the different genes to show how different each group presents. So, for example, one of the first studies I did in this team was with, actually, no, this wasn't one of the first ones, but we have done some work in Coulin de Vries syndrome. They have changes in the Cancer1 gene. And when we studied these kids, we found that many of them had childhood apraxia of speech. And when they got older, they had dysarthria. So that was really important for that group because it meant that they could have really targeted apraxia therapy, and we could give that as a recommendation to the group. We then did a project, actually previous to that, we'd also done a project on Klinefelter syndrome. So this is a different genetic condition on this related to the sex chromosomes. These kids didn't have motor speech conditions for the most part. They actually had more challenges with social language and literacy. So we could give those recommendations to families with Klinefelter syndrome. Another example, just to show the variance in different genes, was with CAT6A. So this was a project that I did as part of my PhD. Kids with CAT6A often remain minimally verbal or non-speaking right until adulthood. So 75% of those kids actually required AAC, or alternative augmentative communication devices, or use sign language. So what we could then give to families after publishing this work was some recommendations on how you can access AAC services from really early on, now that we know that 75% of those kids are not going to use their verbal speech, but actually will rely on communication devices. So this really just shows that different genes have different profiles, and why it's so important that we tease out these differences in speech and language to then give the best recommendations to families. So what does the literature tell us about CACNA1C at the moment? These are some quotes from different research papers that are out there. So you can see people talk about speech delay. They've talked about oral and speech apraxia in some children. They've talked about atypical oral motor skills. Some people have said language delay. Do they mean something different to speech delay? Is it the same thing? Is it actually language, or are they talking about motor speech perhaps? And then others have said verbal disabilities. So we can see that everything's a little bit non-specific. It's not giving us those really distinct diagnoses like dysarthria, articulation disorder, receptive versus expressive language challenges. So the exact language profile isn't clear, and that's what we need to know. That will be really important for treatment. So the aims of the study going forward, what the aims will be to characterise the speech and language abilities of individuals with CACNA1C variants in order to firstly provide this clear communication diagnosis, prognosis and treatment planning for families and clinicians. to investigate any clinical differences corresponding to the variant location. So we call this a genotype-phenotype correlation. So are there particular points in the gene that mean someone is going to be more verbal or less verbal, more likely to have apraxia or less likely, for example? And then we can use this data to inform future speech and language outcome measures or outcome markers that are necessary for clinical trial readiness. This is a little bit about what the study design looks like. So we have a number of different ways that we can assess that speech and language and all those diagnoses. Firstly, we will do one way that we can do this is via online surveys or online assessments. So you'll get sent a link to a survey or an assessment that you complete in your own time on an iPad or on your phone or at your computer, whenever you like. We do face-to-face assessments if someone was here in Melbourne with me, here at the Royal Children's Hospital, or we could do a telehealth assessment for many families that we work with who are overseas. That's majority of the families, as I'm all the way in Australia. So we would schedule a Zoom call and attempt to do an assessment. That might look different depending on the age and the skills of your child. And then for cases where we really struggle to get a really good assessment and we feel like we need a little bit more information, sometimes we ask families to upload reports from their own clinicians or upload a video, which is optional, but sometimes we find that kids give the best communication when they're in their home environment, comfortable with their families, and so we might prompt you if we'd like a video of some communication happening in the home. Every step is optional. So the process would look like starting from the beginning with an online consent form. So we'll send you a link to a consent form. And then we'll start with understanding your medical history, your neurodevelopment, your child's neurodevelopment, and their adaptive behaviour. So how they function in everyday life. We'll do this via our online assessments and perhaps via some report on uploads as well. And then once we do that initial stage, we will have a little bit more information about your child and we will know whether they are verbal, they're speaking using our typical speech that we use, or are they more non-speaking, perhaps communicating in a different way or using an AAC device. So we'll have different assessments catered to your child's level and age and skill. And then we will look at feeding. So to look at feeding, we also do online assessments and we might do some face-to-face or telehealth assessments to assess feeding. We'll look at our speech. So that was our apraxia of speech, our articulation, our phonology. And for our speaking kids, we'll do this via an assessment, either in person or online. For our minimally verbal or our non-speaking kids, we can assess some pre-linguistic skills, so some pre-speech skills via some parent surveys and online questionnaires. And then to assess language with our speaking group, again, some more online surveys via parents and perhaps a telehealth or in-person assessment with the individual. For our minimally verbal or our non-speaking kids, again, an online survey or assessment and perhaps a video upload, like I mentioned before. Really, for many of that, this looks like a lot of information and a lot of things to do, but we try to keep it, fairly relaxed and quite low key. We give families lots of time to do the assessments, and often our telehealth assessments with kids we try to keep it very non-stressful. So just seeing how much we get through. We appreciate that many kids don't like speaking to unfamiliar people from the other side of the globe with a funny accent. So we try and keep it pretty relaxed when we're doing our telehealth assessments. And like I said, every portion is optional. This is just what one survey might look like online. So this is the start of our health and medical survey and what you might see when you click on the screen. Our medical survey has a number of sections. It's our longest survey. And so we show you what that looks like. And then you can see on the screen here, there's a save and return later. So if you sort of get halfway through something and then you feel like you want to come back to it, you can do that. And if you forget, I'll send you a reminder to keep going down the track at some point. So that's the overview of what the study looks like and what would look like for you. We haven't yet started recruiting. As I said, we were sort of working on getting the funding for the project. But if you are really interested and you'd like to be involved in the future, you can email our team at Genetics of Speech at mcri.edu.au, send an email and mention that you'd be interested in the future study, or you can scan this QR code here. You can do one or the other, whatever you prefer, which is our expression of interest form. So I'll get a notification that you've completed that, and then I'll have a list of people who I can contact when we're ready to start recruiting for the study, which is super exciting. Something also to mention is that our surveys are available in a number of languages. So we have everything available in English, but we have lots of things available in other languages as well. So French, Dutch, German, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Chinese, Bulgarian, and Polish. So if you speak any of those languages, you could just mention in the expression of interest form that that's the language that you speak, and we'll try our best to cater to your language. Really appreciate everybody's time spent here. So this is my thank you. This is my email. Like I said, please feel free to email me with any questions, and I look forward to seeing some faces live at the future Q&A session in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks so much.